Wharton professor Jonah Berger, what a pleasure to meet you. I think I have most, if not all, of your best-selling books. Contagious, one of my favorites, The Catalyst, and now Magic Words, What to Say to Get Your Way. Congratulations. You know, you had me at the dedication. It says, to anyone who has ever marveled at the power of words. I'm in. I'm in. Sold.
Well, that was my hope. I think all of us use language all the time, but we don't always think about how we use language. And I've learned a lot about language in the past 10 to 15 years of studying this stuff, and it's been a great opportunity to get a chance to share it with others.
Jonah, can you briefly explain to people what your work has to do with understanding the power of language? Because I know you do a lot of different research, natural language processing, how to get people to change their minds, persuasion. What is your category as a researcher, and how did you get involved with the power of words and magic words in particular?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I actually got started in this space studying a very different topic. So I was interested in what makes people share things, what makes content viral, and was studying the New York Times most emailed list, analyzing the content of that list and the articles that didn't make that list, and trying to figure out, well, why did some articles make the list and others didn't? And the challenge is there are thousands of articles, and it takes a lot of time to score them on different dimensions, right? If you wanted to read each of those articles and rate how positive or negative they were, how surprising they were, how useful they were, it would take a lot of people a lot of time. And so with the help of a colleague, we discovered some software that would score these articles on different dimensions. So how positive or negative they were, how different dimensions scored. And that was my first introduction into what people describe as automated text analysis or natural language processing. And this was in the early 2000s. The paper eventually came out, I believe, in 2012. Was part of my first book, Contagious, but have been using these tools for a long time. We've studied things like customer service interactions to look at the language that agents use that increase customer satisfaction. We've looked at movie scripts and song lyrics to say, well, why are some stories better than others? What makes them more engaging? Well, hey, it would take a long time to rate them ourselves. Why don't we use analysis, objective analysis, to extract those features? And so what's so exciting these days is there's so much language data out there and so many great tools that allow us to study it, right? Everything from customer service calls being transcribed and resumes being out there to repositories of email language. It's allowed us, language isn't new, right? Language has been around forever, but it's allowed us to study language in some novel quantitative ways that have been quite impactful.
I was really impressed with something that you write at the beginning of the book. We use 16,000 words a day, estimated, to talk to friends, to deliver presentations, write emails. Is it your thesis in Magic Words that we think about the ideas that we'd like to communicate, not so much about the specific words we choose to communicate those ideas?
Yeah, I think that's a big challenge, right? As presenters, as leaders, as speakers, as writers, we think a bit about what we want to talk about. I want people to support my initiative. I want the client to buy this product or use this service. And so we think about all the reasons that the client should buy that product or use the service, or why people should support my idea. We think less about the individual words that we use to express those topics or those concepts. And unfortunately, that's a mistake, because subtle shifts, as I talk about in the book, in language can have a huge effect on our impact, right? A particular word in a sentence can lead to a 50% increase in people saying yes. Switching from saying, I like this thing, do I recommend it, makes people about a third more likely to take your recommendation. And in a variety of domains, from the language we use in loan applications to the language we write in email, it leaves traces of our likely future actions. And so there's a lot of opportunities to use language more effectively and to extract insight from other people's language.
Let's dive into something specific that I love the whole book. There's so much great, valuable material for anyone who wants to communicate more persuasively. But one thing in particular I think is very, very powerful. You talk about four ways to speak with confidence. Would you mind if we go through those quickly? Number one, ditch the hedges. Well, what's the difference between hedging a message and delivering a message with confidence?
Yeah, I think a lot of us, as communicators, myself included, we often tend to hedge when we communicate. We say something like, "I think that's a good idea. That might work. Well, that strategy seems pretty effective, right?" And without realizing we're including these hedges to, in some sense, take a step back from our language to say that we're not 100% sure this is right. But the challenge is that people are often persuaded by certainty. There's some nice research that shows that more certain financial advisors, people prefer them. Even when they're no more likely to be right, and even in some cases when they're overconfident, people prefer certain advisors, in part because when people seem so certain, it's hard to believe they can't be right. They're so certain about what they're saying, it's hard not to believe them. And so I think a lot of us look around and we go, oh, I have this person or people in my life that are so charismatic. When they open their mouth, other people listen. And a lot of time, if you look at the things they have in common, whether you look at startup founders, you look at famous leaders, you look at gurus, they often speak with a great deal of certainty, right? They don't say might and could and in my opinion. They say this will definitely happen. Everyone agrees. It's absolutely true that it's obvious this. They use a lot of what are called definites to express a great deal of certainty. And so, as you said, if we want to be perceived more positively, if we want people to take our advice, we need to ditch the hedges. That's not to say we never want to hedge at all, but we certainly don't want to hedge just because it's convenient. Often we hedge.
What's interesting to me, Jonah, I'm thinking about this as we're talking about it, is I just wrote a book that came out a few months ago on Jeff Bezos and Amazon and how they communicate. This reminds me of something at Amazon I learned. They said, avoid weasel words.
Yes.
And the weasel words are very much what the type of hedging or fudging that they want something more specific, not, well, we sort of think this might work. That's not going to fly.
Yeah. And even notice the difference between, rather than saying, I don't know whether this will work, saying, I love this strategy, but for it to work, we need to do these three things.
Oh, God,
right?
Brilliant.
And that's very nicely. There is some uncertainty. It's not that no uncertainty exists. Not you're pretending, but you're saying, I am clear this is good. But for this to work, we need these things to happen. And so owning that uncertainty, I think, can often be better than sort of leaving it out in weasel words, as you said.
Yeah. The fourth way to appear more confident in the words you use, don't, hesitate. Don't hesitate.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are we saying here? Don't use ums and ahs or filler words, or be specific, please. What do we mean by don't hesitate?
This again is something where we all do it because it's a crutch. It's easy to say, when you ask a great question, I'm sitting there going, well, I'm trying to give myself time to think about the answer. But while doing that, at the same time, I'm signaling that I don't really know what I'm saying, and it makes me seem uncertain in some sense because I am. And so there's a difference. It's hard to see when speaking. It's easy to see when it's written. If you look at something that you've said, if you transcribe it, it's often painful. I do this all the time as a communicator. You look what you actually said, and you go, wow, that was repetitive, that was bad. But by seeing the ums and ahs, it can help you get rid of them.
Okay, so being specific. How do I, again, I'm thinking about myself and when I present, what's the difference between hesitating and simply pausing to think about what I'm going to say so I can deliver it clearly and articulate it succinctly?
I think pauses can be quite powerful. They can make you seem more thoughtful, and they can draw an audience's attention.
But I'm hesitating. I'm hesitating for a couple of minutes.
But there's a difference between filling that hesitation with fillers, ums and uhs, than just pausing. And so I just said and but there's a subtle difference there, right? One is both are giving you the time, but one is giving you a time in the way that comes off as more practiced and polished. Not a very long pause. You can certainly pause for too long, but pausing for at least some time signals that you're thoughtful and digesting what's going on, and even encourages the audience to come in and say, "Oh, what are you going to say next?" Right? Whereas ums and ahs make them go, "You don't seem very polished, or know what you're talking about."
Yeah, excellent. The third way to appear more confident is to turn, I don't think most people think about this. This is excellent. Turn past tense or verb tense into present verb tense. Okay, so what you're saying is if you say you studied for a test, if I studied is the verb, studied for a test is past tense. I'm studying for a test is present. How does this influence persuasion in any way?
Let's use
changing the tense.
a slightly different example. So imagine
Okay.
someone comes in the office, a job candidate, and they make a presentation, and someone asks you what you thought of that presentation. You could say, "I liked them," or you could say, "I like them a lot." I think they are a good candidate, or I think they were a good candidate. In that case, in both cases, you're saying, I like this person. But in one case, you're suggesting in the past, I thought they did a good job. I thought they were a good candidate. I liked them. In another, you're saying it more in the present tense. And present tense indicates that something is more general. Take a restaurant. If you say, they had good food, that suggests that when you went a few weeks ago, in your experience, they had good food. If you said they have good food, right? Basically the same thing, but using present tense, it suggests, well, hey, if you go there in the future, the food is probably going to be good. And so when making those statements, we're essentially making an assertion that something is broader or more general beyond our personal experience. It's likely to generalize to others' experiences in the future. And because of that, others think we're more confident because we're willing to make that assertion, and they're more likely to listen to us.
So I should say, I love Jonah Berger's new book, not I loved Jonah's new book.
I mean, hopefully you loved it and continue to love it. But by saying love, it indicates it didn't just happen. It's likely to continue to be the case.
Excellent. And the final point, also very important, know when to express doubt. Okay, so how do we balance appearing confident in the way I use my words and expressing doubt at the same time? How am I supposed to do that, Mr. Wharton, yes. Professor?
And so often with these techniques, as with anything else, the question's not just always do one thing, but when is one thing better and when is something else more appropriate, right? So, sometimes when you're building something, sometimes you need a hammer and sometimes you need a screwdriver, and part of it is knowing when to use each. And so, in general, present tense and using certainty is good. It's persuasive, but there are cases where certainty can be a bad thing, right? Mm-hmm. It can make you seem overconfident. Right. Some very nice research shows that actually indicating a little bit of doubt makes others more likely to meet you in the middle because it suggests you're not dogmatic about your beliefs. Mm-hmm. If you're not completely sure about your own beliefs, you might be more likely to listen to others and you're more receptive to their opinions. And so, as leaders, for example, there's certainly cases where we want to be clear and indicate certainty so others will listen. But there are also some situations where we may want to show that we're receptive to other people's opinions. And that's a case where we want to show a little bit more doubt or uncertainty. And so I think the main thing I would say is first, let's understand what we mean by uncertainty. What words signal uncertainty and what don't. And then second, let's figure out when to use one approach and when to use the other.
That reminds me of something that I've noticed in Silicon Valley, where I live. So I've worked with a lot of entrepreneurs and I meet with a lot of venture capitalists. If you come in absolutely certain, bordering on arrogance, that doesn't come across well to an experienced VC. But if you can express some doubt about an area that you're pursuing or an initiative, and yet say, but this is how I plan to overcome this challenge, that actually leaves venture capitalists with much more confidence in the entrepreneur.
And even though, notice what you're talking about language and context there, right? You're saying, what is the context I'm in? What is the status differential between me as a communicator and my audience? Yeah. Right. When the VC is giving advice to the startup founder, right? The senior VC may want to use a very certain language to show that they know what they're doing, right? They've been there a long time. On the other hand, when they're looking for somebody, they're coming to somebody to raise money, right? That founder may want to show a little bit of deference and a little bit of humility and not be overconfident. And so it depends a bit on the audience and the situation.
But again, it's all getting back to, the central premise of your book and your research, which is be intentional with the words you use. Yes. Too many people spend most of their time fixing, slide number 32, which you should not have 32 slides anyway. That's a different story. They're fixing the slides. No, be intentional about the specific words that you're choosing to use to express your ideas. That's your whole book. And that's what I think is important. Another area of words, and I'm glad you touched on this in chapter 5, which is all about storytelling. You make the very good point that storytelling, which is something that I write about, and great communicators throughout all of history have been good storytellers. There's a difference between a story and a good story. And it sounds like you've done some research into identifying what that more powerful structure is of a good story. Can you explain?
Yeah. One of the reasons I got started in this space was as a writer. I've been forced to shift from being just an academic to trying once in a while my hand at popular writing. And I struggle with it a lot. I find it very difficult. But when I read great popular writing, I sit there and I go, what made this work, right? Not just, wow, it worked, but why, right? When I'm enthralled with a great movie, I go, well, what makes this movie so engaging? What is it doing that makes it effective? And so we analyze tens of thousands of movie scripts to look at what types of dynamics made plots and stories more effective. And we found the same thing that you can often see in great storytellers, right? So one of the podcasts I listen to sometimes by a guy named Guy Raz, and it's called How I Built This.
Yep, I've interviewed Guy. He's fantastic storyteller.
Fantastic storyteller. He has this ability to turn anything into an amazing story. And if you notice, part of what he does is it's easy, particularly if you're talking to a successful person, for them just to focus on the highlights, right? Our company was acquired, and then we went to this much, and then we went to this big, and that's interesting. But honestly, it's not that interesting to listen to, right? I listened. There was an episode of his that I listened to recently with Michael Dell and the founding of Dell Computer, and a lot of it was all highlights. And at a certain point, that's just not that engaging, right? Because my life personally isn't just highlights, right? I have a lot of downs to go with the ups. And so I think, while the view from the top of a mountain is pretty beautiful, it's more beautiful if you hiked up than if you got dropped off by a helicopter, right? Doing that work, going from lows to highs, makes the highs much more engaging. And that's what we find in our research. These ups and downs, sort of more like a roller coaster, makes content more engaging. You're not as sure what's going to happen next. And so you're more likely to dial in. And so whether it's entrepreneurs or others, don't forget about the downsides, right? Don't forget about the failures. The failures make the successes even more engaging and make it a better story.
Yeah, well, boy, we have so much in common because I think about stories in much the same way. And what can leaders learn about telling better stories? I'm still amazed that leaders, many of them do not understand that most people don't want to just hear about those highs. They want to feel the struggles and the adversities along the way. It makes for such an engaging speaker, but also an inspiring one.
If this person overcame their challenges, maybe I can overcome mine, right? Whereas if all I'm seeing is their highlights, I can't really connect with them. They've been hugely successful, but their life doesn't seem like mine, and it doesn't motivate me to do more.
Jonah, since let's end on this. Since your book came out, there's been a lot of talk about Chat GPT, which I've used. I think it's an impressive tool, and it's very good in some ways, certainly for communicators, to enhance communication, to improve things in writing. But where does that leave us? I'm sure you've been thinking about this. Where does it leave writers and people who, if a Chat GPT can write an email, an essay, even a book, okay, not that great, but it can write one and structure it. Where does that leave the rest of us? Where does that leave the human connection? Like you say in chapter 5, human connection. Where does that leave us?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say a couple things. First of all, I think these technology and technological advances are amazing, right? It's amazing that large language models can do these types of things, and they're based on many of the ideas that I talk about in the book, right? Ingesting large amounts of language, understanding the structure behind them, and using machine learning and other tools to produce language. But where I think they're particularly good at the moment is doing exactly that, producing language, right? If your goal is to produce something pretty good quickly at scale, I mean, it's going to take a lot of people a lot of time. That's different, though, than producing the best thing, right? And so if your goal is to answer a lot of emails quite quickly, decently well, I mean, could it replace some customer service? Certainly it could. If the goal is to write the best book anyone's ever read, I think it's not necessarily going to be as good at that, right? And part of it is what it's trained to do. It's not trained to say, this is better than this. It's trained to say, given all the content out there, what's a good answer to this prompt? And so it's often very funny. I think it's certainly exceeded our expectations, but whether it exceeds the abilities of the best writers we know, I don't think it's quite there yet. And so hopefully individuals still have a place as writers and speakers.
Yes, excellent, which is why we need to read books like yours, Magic Words. I think it's good for anybody who wants to improve the way they write, persuade, present, And I'm sure that's, someone who you certainly had in mind. So Jonah, thanks so much for helping to reveal the magic of words in Magic Words. Just terrific book. And now I get to add it to my Berger section of my bookshelf. Thanks so much.
That's very kind of you. Thanks for having me.